This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Black Market Leadership. I am Kevin Black, and boy, do we have an exciting discussion today. I have the prolific author, Anthony Tucker Jones. Hello, Anthony. How are you?
Hi, Kevin. I'm fine. Thank you.
Well, hey, thank you so much for being on here. For the audience here, I met Anthony through LinkedIn. Again, LinkedIn is just a great spot just to network. And I met Anthony through LinkedIn, and I saw all these books that he's been writing, especially on World War II. He's written many. In fact, I'm going to go over his bio here, but he has such a fascinating background. He has such a great reputation. I was like, let's get him on and talk about World War II and really some lessons of leadership and strategy and decision-making. So what do you think, Anthony? Are you up for that today?
Sounds good, Kevin.
Perfect. Well, let me give you Anthony's bio. So Anthony had a career in the British intelligence. He is a respected defense writer and military historian. And for many years, he was the terrorism and security correspondent for intersec, which is the Journal of International Security. He is a highly prolific author. He is a feature and script writer. And get this, over 500 articles published in print and online. And he has over 50 books, people, and they're translated into half a dozen languages. Like I said, he has been around. He is a public speaker. He's been on Channel 4, Sky News, BBC, and RT. So I'm extraordinarily excited to have him. Oh, and by the way, he's been on the History Channel. So really cool. So with that, Tucker, Anthony, did I miss anything?
Sounds good to me, Kevin.
So I want to invite you on because I have been studying World War II my whole life. And I obviously, of the 50 books you have, I know the majority of them are on World War II. I wanted to start a discussion with you really to enlighten our audience because, Black Market Leadership is about disruptors and status quo breakers. And one thing that I have found is studying other disciplines outside of business, such as military history, can just open up a huge, there's so much value. There's so much advantages of knowing other people and other disciplines and how they interact and how they strategize. And you have done such great work in writing that I just want to open this conversation with you. So before we jump into World War II, though, let's talk about your background. First of all, you were British intelligence. Is that correct?
That's right. I used to work a long time ago for something called the Defense Intelligence Staff, which for your American listeners is effectively the equivalent to the American DIA, so the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's basically an analytical body that provides intelligence assessments to Whitehall and central government. I say very much like the DIA does in America.
And just for the audience here, so let's be clear, because I learned this just years ago. The CIA and the DIA are very different. The DIA, what we have, they do intelligence assessments on nations and armies. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Gotcha. And how long were you in that line of work?
I did about a decade and a half with them. It was a good career. I enjoyed it very much, but it just got to the point where it was, time for a change, and eventually moved on. And sort of over the last decade and a half or so, I've moved into writing and to military history, current affairs as well. As you may have seen from my bio, I've written quite a bit on, things like militant Islam, Daesh, and all that sort of thing. So World War II tends to be my focus, but like many military historians, I'm kind of interested in most periods. You obviously have some that are more favourite than others. But
so let me ask you. So before we go into your writings, did you purposely go into intelligence, or was that your first choice?
Yes. Like a lot of people, I was recruited as a graduate. So I'd studied a master's in international relations and strategic studies. So a career with an organization like that actually was a good fit for me. And obviously they agreed. So I mean, really, to be honest with you, I've wanted to be a writer for a long, long time. And I started writing in my teens. And my advice to anyone looking to embark on that sort of career is you've got to be dogged and persistent. It's not an easy career to do. There are an awful lot of freelance writers, journalists, and authors out there. It's not an easy industry to get into, and it's not an easy one to succeed in. But persistence pays off. Like most careers, you just have to be dedicated to your craft.
Yeah, you got to stick to it. And I read. It must have been 2 or 3 years ago. I read a fantastic book by Stephen Pressfield called The War of Art. Have you heard or have you read it?
No, not come across that.
Oh, I highly recommend it. Life-changing book. It really is. But it's funny. What he says is the hardest thing about being a writer, and he wrote not 300. He wrote Gates of Fire and The Ledger and Bagger Vance. So in the U.S. Army, the Gates of Fire is just enormous. It's a must read. But he said the hardest thing about being a writer is sitting down to write. It's actually sitting down to do it. And looking at your CV, all the books, I have to ask, do you go book by book, or do you have like a multitude of open projects right now all around you?
Yes, the way you tend to work is like a lot of authors, fiction and non-fiction. You normally have about 3 books on the go at any one time. So you'll have one that you're just starting, one that you're writing, and then one that's in the final production phase. So, for instance, at the moment, I've spent the last 2 years on and off working on a book on Churchill, and that has just got to the proof stage. So that's when the publisher issues you a PDF or a hard copy of what it looks like. Essentially, it's what we used to call typeset. So you get a printed copy of what it will look like once it's printed. And of course, the joy of that process is you have to go through it to try and weed out any errors, mistakes, typos that creep in. It's a long old process. So so you're right. Typically, for most authors, if they're doing it full time, you've usually probably got at least 3 books on the go. My next project, which I'm probably 2/3 of the way through, is on the Battle of the Bulge. So I've got Battle of the Bulge and Churchill going at the same time. Which can make it for a slightly odd, you tend to flick from one subject to another, but of course you only do it because you're interested in it. Again, Battle of the Bulge, Second World War, subject that fascinates me and a lot of other people. So that's sort of the process, if you like. And writing, like anything else, it's a discipline. I'm not the sort of person that takes truck with you. You have to have inspiration, or you've got to be feeling it, because it doesn't work like that. As you rightly said, to be prolific, it's a discipline, and you have to sit down and you have to say to yourself, today I'm going to do 2,000-3,000 words. And the way I work, and quite a few authors, I think it's quite often actually it's better to write and then polish it afterwards. It's much easier to re-edit something, even if you're not happy with it. You can polish it and re-edit it, and obviously the joys of these days, software like Word, you can cut and paste and do all sorts of things with it. So I'm always a great believer in that, you've got to do the legwork first, and then you polish your manuscript. But of course, it goes through many other processes because you have the copy edit, and like I mentioned earlier, the proof process as well. So it's you can get sick to death of your own work because you end up reading it an awful lot of times. I mentioned Churchill earlier. I'm probably on about the sixth version of going through it. You kind of start to lose the will to live a little bit after a while, and also because the danger as the author is that you then can't see the wood for the trees. I mean, you're the person that wrote it. That's when you do need your copy editor and your commissioning editor and your proofer and everyone else going through it as well to give it that extra polish that it needs.
So when you're not, I'm assuming, because again you're so prolific. I'm assuming that when you're not writing, are you reading, or like, for instance, I mean, obviously you have to read to do research, but what I'm going to ask you is, given today, like YouTube, you mentioned Churchill. I have watched some fantastic interviews with Orson Welles on the Dick Cavett show back in the 70s, and him talking about these great stories about Churchill. It seems there's so many resources out there today, and they're at your fingertips. You just got to really know where to look for them.
Yeah, again, that's part of the discipline of being an author, of course, that you need to have your approach, what it is that you want to say and what you want to argue, and you've got to remain very, very focused on that. You're right, with a project like Churchill, it's very easy to disappear down rabbit holes because you just think, wow, like you say, there's so many stories and so many aspects to his life. But again, you've got to be quite disciplined about that. You've got to go, what is my thesis? What am I arguing? In a sense, it's project management. You've got to stay on project, because if you spend too much time reading all the anecdotal stuff, it drags the process out forever. So you're right, you have to remain focused. So it's, if you're writing a book, what's the purpose of the book? What is it you're arguing? What's the thesis you're trying to put forward? And certainly for me as an author, I mean, my key approach is I want it to be a good read. Foremost, I want you to enjoy reading it. So for with the Churchill project, I don't want you to read about Churchill. I want you to go on Churchill's journey. I want you to be there when he's in the Northwest frontier. I want you to be there when he's in Omdurman. I want you to feel the heat on the back of your neck. These days, of course, writing novels and non-fiction, of course, the styles very much have crossed over, and readers expect that they like the flourishes, and so you need that. So I say, for me, I like a book that draws me in, and I like to think that's what I write. As I say, I want you to experience his journey. I don't want you just to read about it, because that tends to be rather dull. And as you rightly pointed out earlier, we're increasingly visual. We watch things on TV, we watch movies, so our brains are almost hardwired. I mean, I've noticed that in sort of recent decades, and I'm sure you have with novels. Most novels are written as if they're movies, because obviously the author has his eye on the bigger picture, hoping that they will get optioned by a studio. But also, of course, he knows that his readers expect that approach. I'm saying he, sorry, or her, or I should just say the author, shouldn't I? The author knows that that's what their readers expect from them, is that type of style and that approach. And I'm conscious, sort of, probably since someone actually like Cornelius Ryan in the 70s, that was very much a sort of crossover book in style, in that you read about A Bridge Too Far.
Bridge Too Far.
Yeah, but he put you on the ground as well, very cleverly, So I like that approach. So as an author, I like that approach. I want to take you on the journey. I don't just want to educate you, because that's, that can be a dull process, if that makes sense. Not to denigrate history, because obviously I'm a big fan of it, but it's going back really to your original point of, how do you stay focused? What is it you're trying to tell your readers? Again, a recent book I did was on Arnhem, a book called The Devil's Bridge. And with that, I set myself the task of putting the reader in the boots of the Germans, because the Allied side of things with the British and Americans has been covered, enormously over the years. It remains an enormously popular subject. But very few books have actually just tried to put the reader, in the position of the Germans. And again, with that, my sort of approach was, well, we've heard an awful lot about what the British and Americans got wrong with that operation. Those approaches are fine, and that line of argument that, we failed because we got it wrong, again, a fine example of poor project management, poor planning, poor planning and preparation, all those things that went wrong. But actually, because what it doesn't really spell out to people is, what was it the Germans did that gave them a victory? On a one-sided battle, what was it the Germans, when you consider what poor state their army was in the dark days after, for them at least, after Normandy, they were actually in complete state disarray.
I have a question for you. It seems like, books, very much like businesses, you got to have a competitive advantage. You have to have your own distinct way of going at it. And it seems to me that for you, it's not just the content, it's even the manner, the approach, or putting, like you said, at Arnhem, everyone knows about the Americans and the Brits, but they really don't know the German side. So you're bringing a fresh new view along with a perspective that's just not there. Is that kind of what I'm hearing from you?
Yes, I mean, when you're writing a book, you want to educate yourself as much as your reader. So, as the author, you go on that journey of discovery. Most of us have a reasonably good grounding in the subject beforehand, but actually, it's not until you start flipping over rocks, and looking underneath them, that you start realizing actually there's a lot of aspects that you didn't appreciate. And certainly, I discovered that with Arnhem. As you may be aware, there's long been a running debate over the lack of air power for the Allies. That in fact didn't help them. That First Airborne were left on their own up at Oosterbeek, and there were various reasons for this. And one of the ones that they often cite is that the German airfield at Dielen, to the north of Arnhem, was bristling with anti-aircraft guns, whereas in fact the things had gone. The Germans had moved them. So that's a bit of a misnomer, that line of argument. And in fact, while I was writing the book, I discovered the Germans had actually plonked them on a lot of them on a train and were moving them. And Allied fighter bombers had actually destroyed them. They'd actually caught the train on the move, and they destroyed a lot of them. So it's Cornelius Ryan did us a great favour in bringing Arnhem to a wider audience and to our popular imaginations. But also, of course, what he also did was he set the narrative, which again, as a historian, is quite difficult not to follow, if that makes sense. That you're saying, what's my approach? Well, one of my approaches is always context. When you're writing on a subject, what's the wider context? Lots of good books are often written, but they're quite often quite narrow in their focus, which is fine. But of course, for the reader, what it doesn't tell you is what's going on in the periphery, and I always think that's quite important. That was a kind of a challenge I set myself with the Churchill book, was to put his actions and his life in context, because people, as I'm sure you're aware, certainly in the UK, he's taken a bit of a battering in recent times. And you have to go, but everyone held those views. They may not be acceptable today, but everyone held those views. So it just wasn't just him. The other thing, of course, people don't tend to appreciate is his worldview and that of his fellow politicians and generals. They were shaped by conditions of the time. So again, if you don't understand what those conditions were, then you don't understand his mindset. So for me, that was a challenge in writing that book. Again, I wanted readers to understand why and how he came to those decisions. What was the decision-making process? And again, with the Arnhem book that came out last year, I was enthralled with the German decision-making process, because with them, probably the major error that the Allies made was underestimating the Germans, but in particular how quickly they would react.
The Germans.
Again, the Germans. So, to use a business analogy, it's like you underestimating a competitor and them undercutting you really quickly. And that's what the Germans did at Arnhem. Their response was quite exemplary. Irrespective of the rights or wrongs of their cause, their actual combat performance, their chain of command, and what they did was quite remarkable. And that's why they turned it around so quickly. It wasn't just a case of the whole thing failed because the Allies made lots of mistakes. Actually, the Germans did an awful lot of things right, which they had not done since probably mid-July, when they had a litany of mistakes, both on the Western and on the Eastern fronts. They just, thanks to Hitler, he helped the Allies through his insistence on the strategic conduct of the war. But when he gave his commanders free hand, which he essentially did at Arnhem, because of course there were bigger fish to fry at that time, you had the entire Western Front, stretching from southern France up to the Netherlands. Hitler was looking at the bigger picture. So what essentially to the Germans was quite a small battle. They were given free rein to combat, Montgomery's armored thrust.
They were given, I guess, the irony is the Germans were known for Auftragstaktik or mission command, but a lot of the war, Hitler would micromanage those German units and take that one operational flexibility, that ability to maneuver, to react, to respond quickly. He denied that, but apparently, he had bigger fish to fry, as you were saying, on the Western Front instead of Arnhem. You mentioned something, so I'm going to bring this up because you have a book out there, and this is actually going to, I guess, connect to our conversation. There is a battle out there that I don't think a lot of people know about, the Falaise Gap. And I'm saying it right. The Falaise was a Falaise.
Falaise.
The Falaise. Okay, the Falaise Gap. And I've read a couple books about this. I guess you could call it a battle or an operation. I mean, it's big in scope. At least it's big. I think it seems big in scope. It's one of the biggest ones that I remember reading about. But I was shocked reading this that I didn't realize. I mean, I've been reading World War II all these years. I never realized what a missed opportunity to potentially even in the war early by destroying Army Group West, which was the German army facing the Allies as they landed. And I was reading this. What really stuck out to me were lessons of decision making and personalities. And one thing, I guess, if there are four major characters, there's Eisenhower, there's General Montgomery, there's Omar Bradley, then there's Patton. And reading this, because one of the things I do in my work is I get to do behavioral profiling. In reading these, when I read about Eisenhower and Bradley, I saw people who are just highly extroverted. They're about patience and pace and take your time, do it right. I saw about General Montgomery, someone who was very, very focused on precision, details, making sure that you follow systems. And then on the bottom, you have Patton, who is fast, quick pace, likes the big picture. And the irony is you have these people who are slower on top, giving orders, not providing that flexibility on the bottom. So that's kind of like the very, very general explanation. But I like to talk to you about the Falaise Gap. When you did your book on the Falaise Gap, what really stuck out to you? What was there anything that shocked you?
Yes, the thing I learned from that was the failure to close the gap. So essentially that battle is the culmination of the Battle for Normandy following the D-Day landings. It was a sort of a 3-month-long slog to try and break the German defense for a bigger breakout for the Allies to get to the River Seine. And Hitler did the Allies a favor by launching a counter-attack at a place called Mortain. He was trying to cut off Patton's breakthrough, following the American breakout. And he launched this foolish counterattack, which simply drove the German armored forces deeper into a noose. And in doing so, Patton looped round to the south of him, and of course to the north, the Canadians, the Brits, and the Poles were pushing down to meet. And they created this enormous pocket. But throughout the Normandy campaign, there had been a series of friendly fire accidents. And one of the things that they were alarmed about was closing off this huge pocket with, as you say, Panzer Group West, chunks of Army Group B, 7th Army, all trapped in there, all streaming eastwards to the river to try and escape. And if they'd closed off the pocket quickly, that would have pretty much been the end of German resistance on the Western Front. But actually what happened was the vast bulk of the German panzer troops got away. So they left all their equipment behind. But the thing when I wrote this book, I discovered is that almost 100,000 panzer troopers, so crews from the German panzer division, had escaped. And the net result of that was when they got back to Germany, they were re-equipped. And thanks to Albert Speer, the German munitions minister, they churned out all these new tanks and new equipment. They re-equipped them, which of course enabled Hitler to launch his surprise Ardennes offensive, which led to the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Now, that probably would not have happened if those Germans had not escaped from that pocket. So there's a cause and effect there, is that, Falaise was, or Falaise, depending on how you want to pronounce it, was a major victory for the Allies. They scooped up, all told, probably about 240,000 German troops, killed, captured, or wounded. So it was a remarkable victory, but the gloss was slightly lost on those Germans escaping back across the river. So the remarkable thing is they left all their equipment behind on the west bank of the Seine, pretty much. But what they did do is they conducted, and this is another thing I learned, a remarkable rearguard defense at the ancient city of Rouen, which was the birthplace of William the Conqueror, appropriate enough. And they conducted this rearguard action there while they kept the river crossings open long enough for as many German troops to escape as possible. And of course, that had ramifications for later in the war. So that sort of traditional picture of the closing of the pocket being this sort of remarkable victory, actually it was flawed.
it seems like the Falaise. It seems like it was an Allied operational victory that could have been a strategic victory, and I mean, destroying when those troops from Army Group West, when they retreat, if I remember right, when the Battle of the Bulge starts, 60% of all those men who were in the West were actually in the Bulge. So my point is, we could have cut off a huge amount of their manpower and soldiers, their fighting capability, if Patton, I'm assuming if Patton could have swung wider, further into to cut them off. But the fact is, would it be fair to say that under Eisenhower and Bradley, I mean, in Montgomery, what were we just too cautious? Why did this happen?
Well, one of the problems was, you're right, they tried to do a much bigger loop. So they wanted to create an even bigger pocket, but they just couldn't move quickly enough. And I'd say that the Germans conducted a series of quite good rearguard actions. I mean, the remarkable thing, again, with the Germans trapped inside and outside the pocket is they never gave up. You know, a lot of units faced with those conditions normally will lay down their arms and surrender. You know, you're not going anywhere. There's no point in resisting anymore. But the Germans had this ethos, which I think we touched on earlier, and again goes back to, you know, the battle for Arnhem, of putting together Kampfgruppe or battle groups, and they were very, very good at that. And essentially, what they did was anybody to hand will be press ganged into a combat group, given a firearm, and sent to the front. Unlike most armies, you know, all Germans, irrespective of their trade, were, you know, trained to fight as infantrymen, and you'd think that those ad hoc battle groups would be, you know, wouldn't last very long, wouldn't fight very well, because they're typists, they're clerks, you know, they're signalers, you know, all the sort of rear echelon guys mixed in with a few probably hardened veterans from the front line units. Whereas actually they performed remarkably well. I say it goes back to the issue with Arnhem, is that Allied intelligence assessed that the SS that were, you know, refitting or resting north of Arnhem, although there were two divisions, they probably muster at tops about a brigade with maybe 50 odd armoured cars with some tanks in there. So they wrote them off. Whereas actually, of course, they should have known how the Germans had performed in North Africa and in France, that they were a dab hand at cobbling together these combat groups very quickly, and that they would fight very effectively. So the Germans did, going back to your original point, the Germans fought quite good delaying operations and rearguard operations, which helped them get to the river. As I say, one of the reasons why the inner pocket wasn't closed off quick enough was because obviously the Allies, quite rightly, were worried about friendly fire. And also, I think, certainly with Patton, you're right, you know, he was very much a guts and glory general who was a go-getter. But one of the things I discovered with him was actually, during the Normandy campaign, he had this, you know, this reputation for being daring and quite reckless. Whereas in fact, of course, ultra intelligence, you know, Enigma derived intelligence was landing on his desk on a regular basis. So actually, he wasn't in reality quite such the, you know, chance taker that we all in popular imagination think he was, because actually he was a pretty measured general who weighed up the pros and cons of what he was going to do on the basis of some pretty solid intelligence. So, you know, I agree with you. He was a dashing general. You know, he wanted to get up. He wanted to get in the fight, you know, which is a good ethos to have. But actually, when you look at his performance close to detail, he wasn't maybe taking quite as many risks as we always imagined he was, because he was well informed, you know, like any good leader or any good general should be. So he weighed up the pros and cons of what he was doing. And certainly with Normandy, he kind of kept himself on a bit of a leash, because as you probably know, he was under a cloud after his performance in North Africa with the slapping incident. Yes, in Sicily. And, you know, when he'd been given the command of Third Army in Normandy, he knew he was on best behaviour, you know, that he needed to prove that he could follow orders and get the desired result. And a prime example of that was when they were sweeping south, having broken out after Operation Cobra. One of his generals was furious that they were ordered west into Brittany to secure the Breton ports, which the Allies wanted. And one of his armoured commanders, I'm going from memory here, but I think it was 4th Armoured, was confused as to why they were being sent on a wild goose chase west to secure those ports, when that was a job for infantry divisions, not an armoured division, and therefore that he should turn east as soon as possible. And he actually fell out with Patton because Patton told him to obey orders and carry on pushing west, knowing full well that he agreed with the general himself.
Yeah, he was on his best behavior.
Yeah, in the best place for the armoured division was heading east towards the River Seine, because that would, as you said earlier, would have given them a much greater tactical victory. So, going back to your point about that wider loop, part of the problem was that the American army had a wide number of objectives, and also, of course, had to make sure that they were seen to be achieving them, even if that meant it was detriment to the main focus, if you like, which was closing off the pocket as quickly as possible. So that going back to your earlier question, that really answers one of the reasons why they were slow pushing eastward, was because Patton on this rare occasion was actually following orders and doing as he was told. Quite rightly, you're in the military, there's a chain of command.
So,
but Oldham probably post normally Patton would have gone to hell with it, and and gone, I know best, and got on with it. But in those early days, when he took command of Third Army, he was kind of on best behavior.
So I have a question for you. This is fascinating, because I'm talking to a Brit here, again, American here, talking to a Brit right before 4th of July. Good timing. Do you think we Americans, we exaggerate Patton and give too much undue criticism to Montgomery?
Yes. In a nutshell, probably, but that's part of the popular narrative, isn't it? For all of us, that approach to the individual characters of all those famous generals is now kind of set in iron, if you like, and that's how we view them. Whereas, as we all know, people are much more multi-dimensional than that. But of course, in history, people tend to latch on certain characteristics. It's a bit like writing screenplays. For the movies and the TVs, script writers will normally give a character two overriding characteristics, and they jam that home on the viewers, because that's what makes you comfortable with those characters. And in a way, in historical terms, it's very similar on how we view historical figures, is that we remember them for certain aspects of their character. So with Montgomery, yes, he was a cautious general. Was he a slow general? Yes, but he had good reason for being that. He'd obviously come up through the ranks during the First World War. He'd seen the British Expeditionary Force sent scuttling for Dunkirk. He'd seen, the British keep getting driven back in North Africa. So he was a methodical general. The other thing, of course, is that, Britain did not have the manpower that America had. And particularly by 1944, we were beginning to run out of replacements. So, as quite rightly, as in any general's first responsibility, really, it's ultimately to his men. And going back to the issue of, being a military commander is like a project manager or running a business, except if you make a wrong decision, it costs lives. In business, you're going to lose money. You might have to make people redundant. But in military terms, if you make a series of bad decisions, that will cost you men and resources, which ultimately will lead to defeat. So I think, Montgomery had a reason for being cautious, particularly by 1944. The other thing we need to remember, of course, is that 21st Army Group included the Canadians. And again, tough fighters, but they again had a small population. Were not in a position to generate large amounts of manpower, again, like the United States. So treatment of British First Army and Canadian First Army, the British and Canadian armies, you had to bear that in mind, that, with all the time you're trading lights of ground, but is there a better way of doing that? Ultimately, it's a cost risk analysis, if you like. You've got to figure out, what am I prepared to lose? And I think that in a way clouded Montgomery's judgment quite a bit. His one of his biggest failings, actually, of course, is he's famous for the Battle of El Alamein. One of the key battles that turned the tide of the Second World War, and also enabled British and Commonwealth forces to push west, towards Tunisia, where we met up with the British and American forces that had landed in Morocco and Algeria, And of course, that sealed the fate of the Germans and Italians in North Africa. But one of the things that Montgomery did was, again, he marred that victory by his slow pursuit of Rommel. So Rommel got away. So a bit like with the Falaise Gap, lots of Germans got away. In that instance, October 1942, November 1942, Rommel managed to fight successful fighting withdrawal, which meant the Germans were able to resist in North Africa until May 1943. Whereas if he'd caught him or overrun him, the war in North Africa would have ended a lot quicker. But he was pretty slow in his pursuit. And I've seen histories from Bletchley Park and Enigma and the Code Breakers, and I've seen statements from some of those guys going, "We don't understand why Montgomery was so slow, because we were feeding him, Enigma intercept intelligence, informing him what a dire situation that Rommel was in. His tanks were out of fuel, so he had to leave most of them behind. He resorted to stealing transport off the Italians, because obviously his first priority was for German units. So, although he'd fought shoulder to shoulder with the Italians, he left the Italians behind. He was in a right old state. But instead, he managed to fight his way back to the Marath line and conduct another campaign from there to slow down the Allies. So, again, was Montgomery being cautious after El Alamein? Was he worried about further casualties? I don't know, but I just think it was in his nature. So, like say, if you compare him against someone like Patton, I think probably Bradley's a better comparison for Montgomery. Bradley was as we know, was a lot more cautious than Patton.
Oh, yes.
Even to the extent that he's been accused of being plodding. People were quite critical of his performance during the Battle of the Bulge for not being dynamic enough. Again, Patton stole all the glory because, it was his guys that rode to the rescue at Bastogne. So Patton showed himself to be dynamic, and Monty trod on diplomatic toes by inadvertently saying to the press essentially he'd had to ride to the rescue of the Americans, which of course was complete nonsense. And of course gave poor old Eisenhower, who quite frankly was a complete saint in his dealing with all generals, be they American or Allied ones, gave poor old Eisenhower another headache when Montgomery's going, well, we had to ride to the Americans' rescue, and also insisted on commanding American troops north of the Bulge, which actually militarily had a sound logic to it, because it eased the chain of command on the northern shoulder, while Patton was doing his thing to the south. But because that's the other thing with coalition warfare, of course, is you need to remember that there are national politics, diplomatic politics, as well as the military politics involved. Inevitably, generals tread on fellow generals' toes. They tread on politicians' toes.
It's so funny you mention this, because I had a conversation I think about a year or two, and I was talking about Vietnam, and for some reason I was comparing our generals of World War II to Vietnam, and I got this response, and I like to hear your response to this. Well, Vietnam was a very political war. That's why we lost. But I'm thinking, but World War II, talk about politics. You have the Americans, you have the Brits, you have the Churchill here, who, from my reading, it seems like he wanted to reinstall the old Britain, recapture Britain that was lost to the Axis. And the Americans are like, no, we're not here to bring, help you get your colonies back or help to get your empire. We're here for our own purposes. And then you have the Soviets, by the way, who were actually against us when they allied with the Nazis. So we talk about politics. World War II was an enormously political war, enormously. But the fact is, we won, and yeah. I think that's the excuse for our Vietnam as political war. There are many more factors, but that's one thing that I heard that I thought you get a kick out of. But I want to go back, because this kind of goes back to mindsets, because I mentioned Patton and Montgomery. And just to tell you real quick, when I was in college, I went to Virginia Military Institute, and that's where Marshall went. And I went to the Marshall Museum one day, and I was very fortunate. The museum keeper there had all these papers, and he had some papers from Patton, and he showed me something. Now, remember George C. Marshall, for the audience here, almost like the paragon of being a strategic executive. The rule was, if you wrote him a memo, it was no longer than one page. If you couldn't put on one page, you didn't know what you were talking about. He wouldn't accept it. So this caretaker here, Anthony, brings out this letter from Patton. which is 4 pages long, which is all about how God intervened in helping him win the battle, about killing the damn Germans. And Marshall just like, okay, that's Patton. I got to accept that. So I just want to tell you that because that's
well, yes, because Patton believed he was reincarnated, didn't he? So,
yeah, and he's talking to his boss's boss, going totally against the rules, doing his own thing. Like, I'll give you a 4-page letter, not even to the point. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile